All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples, Chapter 17, Section 3, Political Innovations. So when we're talking about politics, we typically want to think of governments. And between the year 1500 and 1750, a lot of the wealth that was being brought into Europe had an impact on the way that governments operated. It allowed governments to, on the one hand, centralize power, that is, to become more powerful, and also to expand, right? However, Europe was not politically unified, right? So we want to say of Europe, there was political, we'll say disunity. In other words, a lot of different political states. One form, and maybe the most common form, was the city-state. This was typically a urban center, which had become, especially after 1500, much more wealthy and influential because of economic activity occurring there. And within that city-state, it could be a family, it could be a prince, it could be a noble, anyone who more or less had control and power in that particular area. City-states were especially popular in places like northern Italy. This also, that's not spelled northern. Northern Italy. For example, cities like Venice were examples of city-states there. This was even the case in northern Italy even before the year 1500. During the Renaissance, a lot of these city-states became very powerful and controlled trade in that area. But you could have various city-states littered throughout the European continent, urban centers in which there's a center of power, whether it's one person or a group of people. On the other hand, there were federations. The Holy Roman Empire was an example of what we might call a federation. That is a loose, kind of decentralized government. According to this map here, maybe let's go ahead and get a different color so we can see where the Holy Roman Empire is. We'll do red. This area here are a bunch of different states, primarily Germanic, right? So most of these are Germanic states, where each individual location is ruled by either a prince or a king or a count or a baron, some form of nobility. They all pretty much can do their own thing in terms of declaring war against one another or raising taxes or doing different things that governments do, but they're loosely held together by this Holy Roman Empire, which only really exists in name. There is a Holy Roman Emperor, which at least in title should be in charge of all this territory in the red, but that is not really the case in reality. Like I said before, one of the key factors here in this period is the ability for certain states to centralize and expand. And there's probably no other better example than that of Spain. So the Spanish monarchy will go in white. Spain is right here. This was a country that we learned earlier was created or formed, the modern Spanish state, in the late 1400s. And because of their discovery of the New World and the wealth that the Spanish Empire extracted out of there, Spain was able to expand and centralize in a very sort of rapid and dramatic pace. The ruler Charles V, who ruled from 1519 to 1556, he was a member of the powerful Habsburg family. So this was the most powerful royal family. They were from Austria, but had, through things like marriages and other alliances, had members that were in charge or in power of kingdoms really all across Europe. And he was not only the king of Spain, but also assumed the title of the Holy Roman Emperor, being also in charge of that territory. Charles V, however, in his effort to expand his borders, also came into conflict with a lot of other states. One was the Ottoman Empire, which was a primarily Islamic empire, fighting frequently in the Mediterranean. If we look here at the map, we could see the Ottoman Empire here in green. Oops. And so especially when it came, where's my mouse? There it is. Especially when it came to war with the Ottomans, and of course the Ottomans are also across the Mediterranean here. There were especially a lot of fights in this area over particularly trade routes as the Spanish and the Ottomans fought. You also had that history there, the history of the Crusades and Holy War, which also pit these two nations at one another. But one thing that Charles V also had to deal with was the Protestant Reformation, and that was to declare war against nations such as the Netherlands, as the Holy Roman Emperor, right, Charles V is, also against Protestant German princes, which continuously sought to break away in this particular region here. Charles V, these wars for the Spanish Empire, we might add, were very expensive. And in many cases, there was some success, but also some failure. Charles V, his successor was Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598. Philip II also added Portugal, so added Portuguese territory to the Spanish crown. At that point, Philip II was not only the Spanish king, he was the Portuguese king, and he was also king of the Holy Roman Empire. In this map, Spain also included or expanded territorial possessions to include that of southern Italy, which belonged to the Spanish monarch as well. We look at the Spanish possessions in the Americas, right? All of this is part of the Spanish crown here. And so you can see that Spain's empire is absolutely massive, under both Charles V and Philip II. Philip II, in expanding the empire, also faced war against the Dutch independence. The Dutch defeated Spain by 1648, but really from the years 1519 to 1648, war between Spain and the Dutch was off and on. Spain was represented by as Catholicism. Many of the Dutch there were Protestant. So Spain was very expansive in terms of where they claimed territory, but also were bogged down in a lot of different conflicts, whether that was fighting the Ottomans, fighting Protestants pretty much wherever they existed, fighting against the Dutch to prevent their independence, and other conflicts in between. Now, because the Spanish military, and in fact most militaries in Europe at the time, relied upon the aristocrats or nobility, the Spanish crown was really reliant upon the nobility and therefore gave them very lax taxation. For the most part, we could summarize this not just about Spain, but most of the European continent. The nobility is exempt from taxation. So the nobility, the class that gets their position based off bloodline, who are in charge mostly of military matters, were exempt from taxation and therefore were able to keep a lot more of their wealth than, let's say, the third estate in Europe. If you're not familiar with Europe's social order in this period, and really dating back to the medieval period, they have a system called the three estates, and pretty much people belong to one of these three classes. You either have those who fight, that is the nobility. Now, by 1500, most nobles are not those who fight, but they're the descendants of the warrior class. They're the landowners, they're very powerful. You have those who pray, who is the church, and of course we know the Catholic Church and everything the church is going through. And then you have everybody else, simply just referred to as the third estate. And when it comes to the issue of taxation, the nobility is exempt, the church is exempt, and pretty much it's this class here that is paying taxes in Europe. Now, this third estate, because of trade, is becoming more powerful. This is where the emerging, and we talked about this last section, 17.2, the bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie, right? The bourgeoisie, a powerful, wealthy merchant class. They're not members of the church. They're not born to any particular bloodline, but they're taking advantage of a lot of the capitalist institutions, and they're really set up to challenge some of these traditional classes here. So in most cases, nobility is exempt from taxation. They're a class of privilege and a class of bloodline. Essentially, is how they maintain it. In Spain, although American silver did make the Spanish crown very rich, it also led to inflation, which could have a negative impact on the economy, and it did in Spain. Impact. And Spain was fully committed to the Counter-Reformation, right? So Spain committed to the Catholic Church. And this didn't just mean fighting wars on behalf of the Catholic Church, but it also meant to expel groups like Jews and Muslims and anyone who challenged the ideas of the Catholic Church, like Galileo. So we might say, scientists as well. And this really impacted Spain and in their ability to keep pace, at least technologically, because a lot of the intellectuals, whether they were religious minorities, whether they were scientists that challenged the Catholic Church, were expelled from within the Spanish borders. It's also true that a lot of merchants wanting to do business also left Spain if they happened to be Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, etc., etc. Instead, right around the 1600s, new states emerge in Europe to assume or claim the title of most powerful. England and France are two nations that really begin to assert their power, in addition to the Dutch, right? So Spain, the Spanish are really kind of early out of the gates. They claim the Americas, they become incredibly wealthy, expand very, very quickly, but then kind of fall behind to other powers like the Dutch, the English, and the French. England has a little bit different of a governing system. There is an English monarch, but there also is an English parliament. And a parliament is a group of nobles, right? So in the case of Spain and France, the monarch, right, is absolute. And in fact, when we get here to France, we'll talk about this term a little bit, absolutism. But in England, there is a monarch, but there also is a parliament. And whereas in Spain, the monarch can pretty much do whatever they want, whenever you have a parliamentary system, the monarchy and the parliament, again, parliament being a group of nobles, fight one another over control and over power. Parliamentary systems are the case in England. We'll also say that parliament exists in the Netherlands, right? These are two parliamentary systems. And there are two examples of when parliament and the monarch, the English king, fight one another. In the English Civil War, the English King Charles I is executed by parliament. And in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the English King James II essentially runs away, fearing that perhaps Parliament might chop off his head. Parliament, in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, puts forward the English Bill of Rights, which provides restrictions on the monarch's power. And this is one thing that makes England very different from most of their other European counterparts. This is also true in the case of a country like the Netherlands. When it comes to who really calls the shots in England, it's not the monarch, it's the parliament, right? Parliament is really the group who makes the laws. And if the king behaves in a way that is maybe too authoritarian, at least we have two examples of Parliament reigning supreme over the English king. In France, it's a completely different story. France, more so than anything else, practices or is an example of absolutism. That is the absolute ruler, absolute rule of the monarchy. Now, France does have something similar, France does have something similar to England's form of parliament. It is called the Estates General. The Estates General represents the various estates in France. So, it's a group which very poorly, but does represent France. And because the king's power is so strong, it is never in session, really. All right, the king has no reason to call the Estates General because in this case, the example we'll use, King Louis XIV, but the French kings are simply so influential and so powerful, they don't need the Estates General. Louis XIV is perhaps the most powerful monarch in Europe during this time period. He is an example of what it means to be an absolute ruler. Two quotes that go along with Louis XIV and his ruling style. He was referred to as the Sun King. Of course, this being a time period where the idea of a heliocentric or sun-centered universe was very popular, so saying more or less everything revolves around him. And his most famous quote saying, "I am the state." In other words, when it comes to France, King Louis is France. There really is nothing above him. To demonstrate his power and authority, he built the Versailles Palace, which you see pictured here, a massive palace that could house up to 10,000 people. And he invited traditionally the classes that threatened his power, and that was the nobility. So the nobility were, in a sense, pacified by the Versailles Palace. They lived there, they wined him, they dined him, they performed various rituals and ceremonies. And because King Louis XIV lived at the palace, if you wanted to get anything done in France, you had to go to the Palace of Versailles and really try and impress the king or kowtow to his wishes. This authority was put forward by this notion of divine right. So divine right is a political philosophy, essentially, that states God put kings on earth to rule. So challenging Louis's power, and this notion of divine right of kings was used by a lot of monarchs across Europe, not just France, but this notion that, the justification for why King Louis should have all the power, well, divine right of kings says that God essentially intended Louis to have this power. Therefore, to defy the rule of the monarch would be the same thing to defy the rule of God. And of course, this was cementing another estate which could potentially challenge Louis's power, and that was the church. So the two traditional threats to monarchical power in France, the nobility, they were brought to Versailles, they were wined and dined, they were pacified, and the church helped really legitimize King Louis's rule by stating, this notion of divine right. However, there is an intellectual movement spreading very rapidly in Europe at this time. That, of course, is the Enlightenment. One of its most critical thinkers, John Locke, who we'll come across again, stated no, divine right is actually not the proper form of government, and that instead it ought to be people should be ruled through consent. This idea that governments rule through consent is sometimes also referred to as the social contract. These ideas will have very influential or will be very influential to later on revolutionary movements we'll get onto in a different chapter. Now, one thing was true about all political systems in Europe, whether it was a city-state, whether it was a massive empire like the Spanish Empire, whether it was a parliamentary system, and that was the fact that these countries were nearly always at war with each other. The most deadly of them being the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. So this was the most destructive of these wars. It was fought mostly in Germany, but also places like the Netherlands. And these wars could range over things like religion. We talked about the Protestant Reformation and how Catholics and Protestants simply killed each other. It could be about nationalism. So, for example, France and Spain, which were both Catholic nations, often fought one another despite the fact they shared a similar religion. And it could be economic. There was a lot of fighting going on in overseas colonies, the Caribbean especially, over sugar colonies, and the reason was to gain more access to wealth, taxation, so you can go out and fight more or less more wars. The consequence of being nearly always at war led to improvements in weapon, particularly guns. And by the time you reach the 1700s, where we're focusing on right here, at least 1750. Europe has the best weapon technology in the world, which gives them a leg up in global conflicts. However, at the same time, many of these monarchs, or not even monarchs, but many of these states relied upon the nobility in order to be in charge of their armies. Military positions were given out as patronage, that is a reward. So what we might say about European militaries between 1500 and 1750 was that this was not a merit. If you're not familiar with the term, merit is one's ability, not a merit-based system. In other words, the generals were assigned because they were born to prominent families. This led to what you might call not the most efficient military systems, but this was more or less the case in most countries. Some notable examples of the pace of military improvement includes the Royal Navy by England. By 1700, England has the most powerful navy. Evidence of this is the defeat of the Spanish Armada. So this is an English victory. Really demonstrated too, the Spanish Armada was in some ways a sign of Spanish regression and English ascension. This picture here is supposed to be the Spanish Armada being defeated by England. By 1700, England emerged as the most powerful naval country, not just really in Europe, but really in the world. On the continent, it really all revolved around France. France was the most powerful. And other European nations made sure that France didn't get out of control. And that's what is referred to as this balance of power. So this was to check French power. So if we look at the map here, again, we're just going to say, what we're looking at is essentially 1500 to 1750. And so the increased wealth that went into Europe, right, allowed a certain number of states to expand their borders and expand much more so than they were in 1500. England, for example, came to incorporate, I'll use maybe a different color here. England, for example, which started off as just the country of England, came to incorporate Scotland and Ireland within its borders. Spain, although they expanded very early in the 1500s, they did end up losing a lot of territories due to warfare on the battlefield. The modern French state came to encapsulate a lot of different territory here. The Russian Empire, which we haven't talked about, the Ottoman Empire, Austria in the middle right here, and Prussia, right, which is the predecessor to the modern day of Germany. So all of these countries really emerge out of this period as being bigger, stronger, more powerful, and incorporating a lot of the smaller territories into their particular region. Now, one thing that these countries all had similar features of was their ability to collect taxes. So paying the piper is essentially tax collection. And what most of these states go from is taxing land, which was really the only source of wealth in Europe prior to this massive influx of trade, to taxing things related to trade goods. And of course, when the value of trade exceeds the value of land, which it did between this period, it makes more sense to begin taxing trade. Historically, European monarchs and empires used tax farmers. That was to hire people to collect taxes. Tax farmers could be corrupt. They could be inefficient. And oftentimes, many people were exempt. Like we said before, the nobility was exempt from these taxes. The church was exempt from these taxes. Now, you do begin to see some changes. So, for example, in England and later on Great Britain, they begin to tax some of the nobles. In other countries, that doesn't come to fruition. But more and more countries move towards direct taxation. That is, rather than hire people to essentially do the tax collecting for them, it's better if the state builds a bureaucracy, hires people not just kind of like as contractors or as mercenaries, so to speak, but actually builds an infrastructure of record keeping, of laws and stuff like that, and their ability to directly tax the trade only allows them to further build bigger armies and conduct warfare in more further reaching places.